Hey, and welcome to the second video of the Framer Playground course. My name is Meng, and today we're going to learn all about design components with overrides. Going back to the files that you have downloaded, you're going to find that for each of these sections, we have a begin and a final file. So if you want to follow this tutorial, you have to open to.begin. Now let's take a look at this UI. Here we want to do some animation to this. So what we need to do is to go to the inspector and go to the override tab. And this is where we're going to click on this tab. The first time you're going to do this, you'll probably end up with examples. And so it's kind of neat because from the examples file, you're going to find a bunch of interactions that you can play with, such as, for example, hover. So I can apply the file examples and then override hover, and then this is where you can start already testing. So when I hover, you can see that the pulse is changing the scale. Of course, you can play around with the other ones like a draggable or rotate, and you can edit the code by clicking on the edit code button. So we're going to do that, and this is where we're going to find the code editor that works directly from Framer. This is the source code for all of the examples that you played around earlier. Now we're gonna create a new one and start from scratch. We're gonna click on the new button and we're gonna name that animate. Press enter. So we have some filler code here. Don't worry about it. We can just select everything and then delete. We're gonna start from scratch so that you can have a better understanding of each line of code. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna import override. Since we're using overrides on design component, this is what we need from the Framer library. So import, and then curly braces, override from quotes Framer. Now, when you save this, it's going to auto format your code for you. And if there's an error in your code, for example, I didn't write override correctly without a capital, for example, it's gonna give me an error. And that is insanely useful when you're learning code so that you have feedback in real time and you know where you're making your mistakes. So now I'm just gonna put back the way it was. And so we have override, and now we're gonna write the animation function called scale. So export function and then scale, parentheses, colon, and we're gonna use the override component from Framer. So override, curly braces, and then enter. Inside the curly braces, we're gonna write return, curly braces, and this is where we're gonna put the override properties. And the one that we're gonna play with is called animate. And then column, curly braces, we're gonna change the scale to 2. So that's it. This should animate the scale to 2. If you save this, it should auto format yet again, and then I'm gonna go to the layers. And here I'm gonna go to my design component and I'm gonna change the override file. We're going to select animate, and then the override, sometimes this needs to be refreshed. So the way you do it is just use deselect it, select it again, and then it should be good. So I'm gonna select the scale, which is the function that I just created, and now I can test this. So very quickly, if you refresh this, you're gonna see that very quick animation. We just need to customize that animation. So we're gonna go back to our code editor. And when you change the code, in fact, it's gonna update right here. So that's gonna be really useful. Now let's add a duration so that the animation is slower. So we're gonna add a transition property. And here, I'm going to do curly braces, duration, and then set it to 5. Once you apply that, you're gonna see the animation going way slower than it used to. And we can customize a bunch of things. So for example, we can add ease. I'm gonna set it to linear instead. And then we're gonna make it so that it loops back and forth. So we can add yo-yo, infinity. Now it's really useful to use the auto-completion. So do that as often as you can, especially when it makes sense. So I'm gonna click infinity right here, and we should be seeing the result, and it should be going back and forth. As for the animation property, we can also apply other kinds of CSS properties, such as, let's say, opacity. So we're gonna set it to 0. So now it should start disappearing and then reappearing back and forth. Cool, so that wasn't too bad, was it? Now we're gonna do a new interaction called a drag. So we're gonna create a new file now. So new file, then drag, press enter. And this is where we're gonna create again from scratch. I'm gonna close this for now because it's going to apply to a different screen. Now we're gonna use the same lines of code pretty much. So import, curly braces, override from Framer. And then export function. It's gonna be called drag, parentheses, colon, and then override. Curly braces, return, curly braces, and this is where we're gonna change the drag property. Drag, double quote, Y. And that's it. Let's play around with it. We're gonna go to the layers and we're gonna find this home screen right here where we're gonna start applying the new override. So I'm gonna click on this front card right here. I'm gonna go to override. I'm going to select drag and select drag. So that's it. Click on the whole screen and we can start previewing this. And already you can see that I can drag this thing, but the problem is if you don't add constraints, you're gonna see that it falls off the screen and there's no way to get it back. So let's go ahead and add those constraints. I'm gonna go back to the code and I'm going to add a new property called drag constraints. And here, try to use the auto completions as much as you can. So I'm gonna select this or just press enter. And then we're gonna set it to curly braces, top, and then minus 790, comma, bottom, I'm gonna set it to 0. So what this means is that when I drag, there's gonna be a maximum. So you can see that it's limited to those constraints, and the same from the top, it's limited to those constraints as well. So now we have really nice card that you can drag around, and you can even interact with the content inside of that card. So I think that's a really nice feature in Framer. Next, I want to show you how to do the tab interaction and also how to toggle back and forth some of the animation. So we're going to create a new file called tab. And again, delete everything. Let's close the preview and import override yet again. So import override from Framer. Export function move, parentheses, override, curly braces, return curly braces again. Now what we're gonna change is the animate property again. So animate, but instead of using the properties using curly braces, I'm going to use one of the components from the Framer library called use cycle. This is going to allow me to toggle back and forth between two animations properties. So right before the return, after the curly braces, I'm going to write const square brackets, and when you write square brackets it's because you have multiple values, and we're gonna write animate, comma, cycle. So animate is going to be our animation properties, and cycle is like in React hooks for set state, which is a function that's going to toggle between those animation properties. After this equal, we're gonna use cycle, parentheses, curly braces for our first set of animation properties. We're only gonna use top, and we're gonna set it to 205, and then comma, another set of curly braces, set it to top 0. So what this means is that at the beginning, it's going to be 0, and then it's going to toggle to 205, and then back and forth. You might have noticed, for those who have used React hooks, that this is very similar. So you have the state. In our case, this is the animation properties. This is like set state, but we're using useCycle because we want to toggle back and forth. And then we're changing those states. So let's apply our animation property. So we're gonna put animate, which is the value that we set right here. And then we're also gonna use the event called onTap, parentheses, curly braces. And inside this event, we're going to call a cycle, parentheses. So this is going to toggle the states. Let's test it out. We're gonna go to the layers. We're gonna select the back card and apply the override. I'm going to select tap and move. Let's go to the whole frame and then click on preview. And now you're gonna see that when I tap on this back card, it toggles between that position to this position. So I'm gonna click again and it goes back like this. Awesome. So now let's play around with the hover states using variants. We're gonna close this, we're gonna go to the code editor, click on a new code component, we're gonna name it button. Select everything and delete. Again, we're gonna import override from Framer. And then we're going to declare variants using const variants is equal to curly braces. So the thing about variants is that they can store multiple states of animation properties that can be applied to components, and then they can also be applied to children. So this is really useful for, let's say, a hover interaction that switch back and forth. It's very similar to useCycle, except that you can apply to children, but also you have more flexibility to the way that you manipulate those variants. So let's have two states. The first one is going to be called initial, curly braces, and we're only going to change the background. So background, double quotes, we're going to set it to blue, and then comma, on the second state, we're going to set to tapped, curly braces, changing the background yet again, and set it to black. Now we're going to create our override. So export function button, parentheses, override, curly braces, return curly braces. So we're gonna apply different properties. The first one, variants, where we apply the variants that we just declared. So variants, comma. And then now you can target those variant states such as initial and tap. So for example, for the initial property, I'm gonna set it to double quotes, initial. So this is going to use the initial set of properties. Then we're gonna use an action called while tap, meaning that while you're pressing on the button, and this is useful for mobile devices, and set the variant name to tap that we declared earlier. So let's preview this. I'm gonna go to my design right here for the login page, and then I'm going to apply the variants interaction to this login button. So I'm gonna apply override, set to button, override button, and then now I'm ready to preview this. So you can see that by default is blue, and when I tap on it, it becomes black. And if I want the right color, I just need to check this color and get the hex code. Go back to the code and put here. Awesome. So now you can see that we have the right color. The last thing I want to show you today is how to deal with this interaction, because it's a little bit more complex than what we have right here. The thing is, as a designer, what I want is that when the user taps on this, I want this to go up, but I also want this to go down at the same time. But for that to happen, I need to be able to communicate between two design components, right? So I'm using an override here, but using this override, I want this to also apply to this design component at the same time. So let's learn how to do that. I'm gonna go back to the code. I'm going to create a new code component called home. Delete all the code. Then I'm going to import three things from the Framer library. So import curly braces. And by the way, if you don't want to write these manually because you love autocompletion, so what you can do is simply write it later. So we're gonna do from and then the name of the library first, so Framer. And because now we have a context of what library that we're using, we can use autocompletion. So override, now we know that it exists. We're also gonna use useCycle. Again, it does exist. And the last one is called data. Voila. Cool, so that's what we're gonna be needing. It's called data. So data is going to be passed between those overrides. So we're gonna declare const data is equal to data. So the difference between the two, one is without a capital D and the other one with a capital D, and usually it's because this one is a custom variable and this one is usually something that you import. So it's kind of important to understand the difference between the two. And as you get more familiar with programming, this is gonna become kind of second nature to you. Another cool tip while you're using code editors is that when you select, let's say, a variable or an object, then usually when it's written exactly the same way, you're gonna see those words highlighted. So that's kind of really cool to know. All right, so we're gonna use the data component from the Framer library. And now I'm gonna set parentheses, curly braces, and it's simply going to have a bunch of properties. The only thing that we're gonna set is active to false. So we're using a Boolean. It's simply a true or false kind of thing. And this is really useful when you're setting conditions and stuff like that. So with this data that's going to be passed between overrides, we're now gonna set our first override. So export function card front parentheses, and then we're gonna use override again, curly braces, return curly braces. We're going to apply the same properties as we had before. So drag y, comma, drag constraints, curly braces, top minus 790, comma, bottom 0. Now for the back card, we're gonna again use the same code. So export function card back parentheses, override curly braces, return curly braces. We're gonna set a drag for the position Y because we want both cards to be draggable as well. The drag constraints for the second card, so the back card, is going to be top minus 200 and then bottom 0. We're going to reapply the useCycle thing that we did earlier. If you remember, when you go to the tab file, we used a useCycle and then we applied the animate state with the function cycle that toggles between this position and this position. So we can basically redo the same thing in the home file. So now we're gonna set const animate, comma, cycle is equal to useCycle parentheses curly braces top 205 and then comma curly braces top 0. Let's apply the animate state to the animate property. So animate set to animate, comma, and then set the event on tap, parentheses, curly braces, call the function called cycle. And at this point, we have two overrides that are not really communicating with each other. So what's left to do is to use the data state called isActive, that is by default false, to use that and change the animations for both of those overrides. So the first thing I'm gonna do is to apply these things so that you can see what is happening while we're coding. So I'm gonna go to the layers, and here for each of those cards, I'm going to apply the overrides. The first thing is for the back card, I'm gonna select the home file. So we're changing from the tab file to the home file, and we're setting card back. And then for the front card, going back to the home file and set it to the card front. And so I can start previewing this, and it's not gonna do much. It's going to do exactly what it used to do. So this is draggable and this is just tappable, but we also added the drag constraints as well. Now let's go back to the code and make sure that when we tap here, this will animate as well. So we need to communicate by tapping here to this override as well. So when the user tap here, the event on tap is called, right? And basically what we need to do is that when that happens, we want to change the data call is active to true. So we can do data dot is active is equal to true. Now nothing is happening yet because we haven't applied the properties based on our data change. So what we're gonna do is that for the card front, we're going to change the positioning when this happens. So I'm gonna add a new property called animate, curly braces. I'm gonna change the top property and I'm going to write a condition. If active is true, set the top positioning to something, else set another top position. So we're gonna write it in a ternary operator, which is a simpler way to write if-else statements. So the way it works is that we're gonna set data is active, question mark. So is this true or false? The first value is for the condition that this is true, so 700. And then using colon, I'm gonna do the else value. I'm going to set to 300. So is active true? Set to 700. Else set to 300. So now I'm gonna click here and you can see that this is transitioning as well. Now the thing is, if I click back, it doesn't actually toggle because every time that I click, it just set it to true all the time. And so we're gonna use a little trick to change this true or false back and forth. Instead of setting this to true, I'm gonna set it to not is active. So I'm gonna set exclamation point data dot is active. What this means is that it's going to set the opposite value. So every time that we click, it just sets from true to false and back and forth. So now when I click here, it's going to open this, and when I click again, it's going back and it's gonna animate both overrides at the same time. So that's it for today. We've learned a lot of things, such as very basic interactions such as animation, and then we learn how to drag, we learn how to tap, we learn how to change the cycle. We managed to communicate between two overrides using data. Now, I want to say that it's okay if you don't understand everything right now. You don't need to understand everything right now. You can start with the basics, such as very basic animation properties and how to write very basic overrides, and that will be enough to create an amazing prototype. But for those who wants to push their prototype even further, I think it's really important to know how to use these different events, how to use the cycle, and how to use the data. And by the way, it doesn't mean that from now on the code is gonna get more and more complex. In fact, there are a lot of code in the future that's going to be even simpler than what we have written today. So pick up what you can and let's create an awesome prototype. In the next session, I'm going to show you how to write really cool stagger animations and then how to use a page interaction and pass the data between multiple overrides. So thanks for following along so far. I'll see you in the next session.